The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, established in January 2025, is on the verge of collapse. Tensions are escalating, raising fears of renewed violence. Both sides accuse each other of violating the agreement. The international community urges restraint and negotiations. The stakes are incredibly high. The roots of the current crisis can be traced back to the events of October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel. The assault, which involved a coordinated incursion across the border from Gaza and a barrage of rockets fired into Israeli territory, caught Israel off guard. The attacks resulted in the deaths of over 1,200 people, marking one of the deadliest days in Israel's history. Israel responded swiftly and forcefully, launching a military operation in Gaza aimed at degrading Hamas's military capabilities and deterring future attacks. The Israeli Defense Forces carried out airstrikes targeting Hamas infrastructure, including tunnels, rocket launchers, and command centers. The conflict quickly escalated into a full-blown war, with both sides exchanging fire across the border. The intensity of the fighting and the high number of civilian casualties drew international condemnation. The United Nations called for an immediate ceasefire, urging both sides to protect civilians and prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. However, despite diplomatic efforts, the fighting raged on for weeks, leaving a trail of destruction and despair in its wake. The October 2023 war was a stark reminder of the volatile nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the ever-present threat of violence. It also highlighted the human cost of the conflict, as innocent civilians on both sides were caught in the crossfire. After weeks of intense fighting and heavy casualties on both sides, a ceasefire agreement was reached between Israel and Hamas in January 2025. The agreement, brokered by Egypt with the support of the international community, aimed to bring an end to the hostilities and pave the way for a more durable peace. The ceasefire agreement was structured in 3 distinct stages, each with its own set of objectives and timelines. The first stage, which came into effect on January 15, 2025, focused on immediate steps to de-escalate the situation and address urgent humanitarian needs. This included a complete cessation of hostilities, the release of hostages held by Hamas, and the resumption of essential goods and services to the Gaza Strip. The second stage of the ceasefire, scheduled to begin following the successful implementation of the first stage, was intended to address more complex and politically sensitive issues. This included negotiations on a long-term ceasefire arrangement, the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, and the reconstruction of Gaza. The third and final stage of the ceasefire envisioned a comprehensive agreement that would address the root causes of the conflict and pave the way for a just and lasting peace. This included resolving the status of Jerusalem, finding a solution to the issue of Palestinian refugees, and ending the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. The initial weeks following the implementation of the ceasefire agreement saw some progress, particularly in the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. However, the second stage of the agreement, which was intended to address more substantive issues, has been plagued by delays and disagreements. One of the main sticking points has been the issue of hostages. Hamas is still holding a number of Israeli civilians, and the bodies of Israeli soldiers killed in the conflict. Israel has demanded their unconditional release as a precondition for further negotiations. Hamas, on the other hand, has linked the release of hostages to the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Another major obstacle has been the issue of reconstruction in Gaza. The Gaza Strip suffered extensive damage during the conflict, with thousands of homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure destroyed or damaged. While some aid has been allowed into Gaza, Israel has imposed restrictions on the entry of certain materials, citing security concerns. This has slowed down the reconstruction process and exacerbated the already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. The lack of progress on these key issues has led to growing frustration and mistrust between the two sides. Israel has accused Hamas of using the ceasefire to rearm and rebuild its military capabilities. Hamas, in turn, has accused Israel of not fulfilling its commitments under the ceasefire agreement and of imposing a blockade on Gaza. Section 5. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The Gaza Strip, home to over 2 million Palestinians, has been under Israeli blockade for over 15 years. The blockade, which restricts the movement of people and goods in and out of Gaza, has had a devastating impact on the territory's economy, and, well, the living conditions of its residents. The recent conflict has only exacerbated the already dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. The fighting resulted in widespread destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and other critical infrastructure. Thousands of families were displaced from their homes, and many are still living in overcrowded shelters or in the rubble of their destroyed homes. The healthcare system in Gaza, already on the brink of collapse before the conflict, has been overwhelmed by the number of casualties. The blockade has also severely restricted the entry of essential goods and services into Gaza, including food, fuel, and medical supplies. This has led to shortages of basic necessities and a sharp increase in prices, making it even more difficult for Gazans to meet their basic needs. The United Nations has warned that Gaza is facing a humanitarian catastrophe, with the risk of famine and disease looming large. The international community has pledged millions of dollars in aid to Gaza, but the delivery of aid has been hampered by the blockade and the slow pace of reconstruction. The recent escalation of violence between Israel and Hamas has drawn widespread international condemnation. The United Nations, the European Union, and numerous countries have called for an immediate ceasefire and a return to negotiations. The United States, Israel's closest ally, has expressed its support for Israel's right to defend itself, but has also urged restraint and a de-escalation of the violence. The Biden administration has been engaged in diplomatic efforts to try to broker a ceasefire and revive the stalled peace process. Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar, have also played an active role in trying to mediate between Israel and Hamas. These countries have condemned the violence and called on both sides to show restraint and work towards a political solution. However, despite the international pressure and diplomatic efforts, the situation on the ground remains highly volatile. Both Israel and Hamas have shown little willingness to compromise, and the risk of further escalation remains high. Despite the ceasefire agreement being in place, recent weeks have seen a worrying uptick in violence and inflammatory rhetoric. This has further diminished hopes for a peaceful resolution and raised fears of a return to full-blown conflict. A series of incidents have served to heighten tensions. In one such incident, a 70-year-old man was killed, and several others were wounded in a stabbing attack in Haifa, which Israeli police attributed to terrorism. Hamas praised the attack, further inflaming the situation. Adding fuel to the fire, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, known for his far-right views, made provocative statements during a recent visit to the United States. Smotrich hinted at the possibility of cutting off electricity and water supplies to Gaza and threatened a new offensive against Hamas. These actions and statements have been met with condemnation from the international community and have served to further erode trust between the two sides. They underscore the fragility of the ceasefire and the ever-present potential for the situation to spiral out of control. As the ceasefire continues to teeter on the brink, the future remains deeply uncertain. The possibility of a resumption of large-scale conflict looms large, with potentially devastating consequences for both Israelis and Palestinians. Several factors contribute to this uncertainty. The underlying issues that sparked the conflict remain unresolved. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza continues to worsen. Mistrust between the two sides is at an all-time high, and extremists on both sides appear intent on derailing any prospect of peace. While the international community continues to urge restraint and call for a return to negotiations, there is a growing sense that these pleas are falling on deaf ears. The current trajectory appears to be one of continued escalation and violence, with no clear path towards a sustainable peace. In the face of this bleak outlook, it is more important than ever to amplify the voices calling for peace and to provide unwavering support to those working tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire. The international community must not waver in its condemnation of violence and its insistence on a negotiated solution. It must also continue to provide humanitarian assistance to those in need, particularly in Gaza, where the situation is increasingly dire. Ultimately, a lasting peace can only be achieved through dialogue and compromise. It is imperative that both sides summon the political will to return to the negotiating table and engage in good faith efforts to find a peaceful resolution to this decades-long conflict. The alternative, a return to full-blown war, is simply too horrific to contemplate.